There's one kinnot that we read last night and we're going to repeat this morning. It's a kinnot, which is the conversation between the Aseres HaShvatim and the Shvatim of Yehuda and Binyamin. And the kinnot tells over how each of the Shvatim are discussing whose suffering is worse. The king of Ashur, Melech Ashur, has consumed my children, taken away our clothing, our jewelry. He responds, you were exiled once, we went into Golus many times. Va'aliva titzak nisrafu armoinai v'taimer tzion azavani Hashem. It almost sounds like two cancer patients meeting up in the lunchroom of the cancer ward. And each child sitting there without their hair, barely able to consume normal food. One just finished one round of chemo. The other one's beginning his second round of chemo. And the conversation that they have, one says to the other, I'm here for my second time. And the other responds, but the amount of medication that I'm taking and the pain that I'm in. And the other responds, I'm so used to being in the hospital, I don't even remember what it means to sleep in my own bed. And the other responds, such a pathetic conversation. That's the conversation of the Kinnos. That's the discussion that we began last night. How all tsaros, all calamities, all destruction, all horrible events, all tears and all pain are all traced back to where we're sitting here today. The Chassam Sofer writes that we all know that one who dies al Kiddush Hashem is a karban. We all heard after the Kadesh Miron how Hashem Kaviyachol picked flowers to adorn his Kisei HaKavod. But says the Chassam Sofer, every karban needs nisachim, needs libations to accompany the karban. What is that? What is the nisachim for the karbanos? Says the Chassam Sofer, that's our tears, the tears that we shed, the tears of Tisha B'Av, the tears of Yom Kippur, the tears that come together with the tsaros. Klal Yisrael's tears is the way that we connect with the Kadeshim. We all know the Kadeshim go straight up to a very, very special place up in Shemayim. And sometimes we wonder, but what about us? We all hope, we all dream that if we were in such a situation, no one wants to be in such a situation. But how do we connect? Says the Chassam Sofer, it's with the tears. It's with the tears of Tisha B'Av. Every dot of wetness is our connection, is our nisachim. But the problem which we began discussing last night is we're so closed, we're so hardened. And I heard one interesting explanation that if you think about it, go back into a shtetl, a little shtetl back in Europe. Who did you know? What news did you know? You knew the 50, 60, 70 people in your little town. And what was a bad day? What was a good day? And how many tsaros did you know of throughout your life? There was no news. There was no communication. Maybe when there was like a forest fire that burnt down the whole city, the neighboring town would hear about it. But how much tsaros did a person have to endure? Only that within his immediate little world. But nowadays, a day doesn't go by that we don't hear of another death, of another illness, of another terrorist attack, of another horrible situation, of another tragedy, of another Meron. I'll never forget when I was on the phone, I was in Eretz Yisrael, it was 1:30 in the morning, and the first reports came in about some bleachers collapsed and people falling, and I was on the phone with someone and he says, I'm going to call up Eli Beer, a good friend of mine, and I'll find out what's going on. I don't think he got through to Eli Beer as there were thousands of people. But just to digest such news, and then the bleachers collapsing in Stalin, and one after another, such tsaros. And what happens is, and we hear about a death, and we hear about an illness, and we hear about a young person, and we hear about children. What happens is we become so hard. We become so accustomed to it. It's just another piece of news, just another bit of information. How many people do we know that are sick? How many times a day are we told, or do we see a message to say Tehillim for this one, or we're collecting money for this terrible situation? What it does is it makes us so hard, it makes us so callous, it makes us unable to feel the pain anymore. Like the callus on the bottom of your feet, when it doesn't get cut, there's no blood anymore. We have no more of that blood, we have no more of that freshness. So when we sit, and even when we hear stories, and even when we try to connect, we're so hard and we're so closed, and those bechiyos, those tears, what we want to be part of those karbanos of the Kedoshim. We want to be those nisachim, those libations. But it's so difficult. And Rameir Shapiro explains, where does the word tear come from? Bechi, to cry, to wail. He says it's the same word as mevucha, as confusion. And there's certainly one thing that we all could feel and know that's real, and that's that we're all confused. We might not be able to feel the pain of suffering. We might not be able to feel the pain of the Shekhinah not having its home. We might not be able to really connect and really digest and really be able to fathom. But one thing is for sure, are we confused? Are we in a mevucha? Do we live our lives wondering, should I do this? Should I do that? What's better for me? How is it possible for me to do this? It's so difficult. The mevucha, the confusion is real, is so, so real. Many years ago, if you ever try, which you shouldn't, in camp to walk down to the lake on a Friday night, it's pitch black. So what goes on is you're part of a little world here called camp, and there's lights, and there's people, and there's society. And then you walk past a baseball field, and a basketball, and a tennis, and a volleyball, and you get to a forest, and you enter into the woods, and it's still a little bit light. And you walk a few more feet, and it starts getting darker. And you walk a few more feet, and it gets darker. And you walk a little bit down that first incline. You walk a little bit downward, and all of a sudden it's pitch black. And if you were to do that by yourself, what happens is, all of a sudden, you're gripped with fear. And you might wonder, what are you afraid about? What's there to be afraid about? When you turn around and you look up, you see all the lights. And you know that 30 seconds you can walk up that hill and you're back with society and you're back with all the people. But yet, when you're down in that darkness, the fear, you actually start feeling a little bit inside. What's that fear? That's the fear of confusion, of helplessness. We know that when we know what to do, when we're in a difficult situation, but we know which doctor to go to, if we have a difficult test and we know how to study and we know how to push ourselves, it's not so difficult. But when we feel helpless, when we feel like there's nothing we can do, we're just confused. Which way should we turn? What should we do? That's when the fear sits in. That's the mevucha. That is something that we all could certainly tap into on Tisha B'Av. So as we hear different stories, and I'll conclude with 2 stories in a moment, as we hear different stories, and we try to connect, and we try to digest, and we try to feel the pain of the story, of the situation, and we feel it, but it's harder to take it to the next level. Just think how confused we are. Think how much, why do we want that Beis HaMikdash? Because wouldn't you want a Navi to be standing in front of you to tell you exactly what you're supposed to do? You have these koiches, you have these talents, you have this ability, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. We live a life of complete confusion, we don't know where to turn, we don't know what to do. Of course, we know we're in yeshiva, and we know the general direction, but how often do we just feel lost? How often do we feel like we're going down and we're in the middle of the forest, and it's pitch black, and all of a sudden we start having that fear set in, and we're just wondering, why are we even Why are we even afraid? We know we could just walk up a few steps and we'll be back. The reason is because we're just so confused. And the Bluzhever Rebbe was standing at a selection, and happened to have been on Hoshana Rabbah, and a woman comes over to him and says, Rebbe, do you have a knife? I need a knife. And she looks like she's gripped with fear and with terror. And the Rebbe turns to her, and the Rebbe knows why she wants a knife. She can't bear the selection which is going to send her one way to death, and she can't fathom the pain, and therefore she just wants to take her own life. And the Rebbe looks at this woman, and the Rebbe says, just wait a little bit. And the woman's getting more crazy. I need a knife. Give me a knife. And the Rebbe says, just wait. You never know. A few more minutes. And the woman's starting to lose it. And all of a sudden, a Nazi guard walks over. And the Nazi guard sees this woman, and the woman turns to the Nazi guard and says, do you have a knife? Asks the Nazi guard for a knife. And the Nazi guard is just so taken aback. What in the world is she asking for? And the Rebbe remains silent. And before the Nazi guard can even open his mouth, the woman notices on the Nazi guard's belt, he has a knife. And she goes and she grabs the Nazi's knife. And as the Nazi draws his gun, thinking maybe this woman's going to stab him, he sees that this woman's taking the knife and she's bending down to the ground. And the Nazi is silent. And all of a sudden, everyone notices that on the ground there's a little blanket, a little sack. And the woman bends down, and the woman takes out of the sack a little baby. And the Nazi guard watches as this woman opens up this little baby, a brand new, an 8-year-old baby, and she makes the bracha aloud, Asher Kidishanu b'mitzvaysav, lachnisai b'brisai shel Avram Avinu. And she takes the knife in front of the Nazi guard, in front of the Bluzhva Rebbe, and she gives her son the bris, and she turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and she says, Hashem, you gave me a healthy child, and I'm returning back to you a Yiddish neshama. Each and every one of us is that Yiddish neshama. We sometimes can't find it. We sometimes don't feel we have the courage. And we're going to conclude with one final story. Just to realize what we really are. And I couldn't help but fathom last night, hundreds of people, hundreds of kids. Could anyone in the world fathom that they're mourning over something of thousands of years ago, and no one is doing anything wrong, and everything is going well, and everyone is cooperating, and everyone is being serious? How is that possible? And we look around here, and people are already hungry, and people are already tired, and I'm sure people's headaches have already set in, and people are sitting, and people are trying, and everyone is slowly going into his little world, his little place of confusion, of mevucha, the place in which we might not tap into that bechi, we might not find that tear, but we're all going into our little world of Tisha B'Av, a world which hopefully we only have a few hours left. When we emerge from that world, we'll emerge different people, we'll emerge better people. We're all going into that little world and just realize the greatness that is, and realize what it means, as we spoke last night, that our neshamas are really crying as we're all trying to feel that connection. And we'll conclude with Ramendel from a place called the Bayanitz. And Ramendel was on the final journey to Treblinka. And as he's going, they finally get out of the cattle car, and he knows what that means. And all the Germans start barking, and the dogs and the guns. And they start pushing them, shoving them towards their quote-unquote final destination, the gas chambers. And as Ramendel is walking, similar to the previous story, he stumbles upon something on the ground. And it's a little baby. And he picks up the baby, and he realizes the baby is bleeding, the baby is crying. And he holds the baby, and he's looking for the baby's mother. And the Nazi guard sees the Rav holding a baby, and he says, Rabbiner, you have such a beautiful beard. You'll lead the procession to the showers. And Ramendel, holding this little baby, leads all the Yidden as they're walking towards their final destination. And as he's walking, he turns around holding this child. And he says, Rabbi Isai, do you see what I'm holding? I'm holding Kiddusha. There's nothing more precious in the world than a little neshama, than a baby child. And people who couldn't feel anymore, people that just finished death marches and cattle cars and Nazis and heading towards the gas chambers. And he starts talking to them, and he says, why? Why do the Nazis want to kill this little baby? He says, when the Nazis came to my house, they started beating me and punching me. But then they saw a Sefer Torah in the corner. And because they saw a Sefer Torah, they took me and they threw me on the floor. And they went to the Sefer Torah and they threw the Sefer Torah on the floor. And they started pouncing on it and stepping on it. But why? A Sefer Torah is an inanimate object. A Sefer Torah is not a life. Why were the Nazis so interested in destroying the Sefer Torah? And Remendel turns to the people and he says, when you're in darkness and there's a little bit of light, the little bit of light hurts your eyes, and you try to push away that little bit of light. He says, the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, are darkness. And when they see a little bit of light, and when they see a Yid, and when they see a Sefer Torah, what do they want to do? They want to blot out that darkness. And therefore, when they see a little baby, when they see a baby, what's the baby done? They want to destroy it because they see the light, they see the neshama shining, and the people starting to have a little life in them. He tells all of them as they're walking towards the gas chambers, you didn't realize that we all have that heilige neshama. We all are holy. And he picks up the baby and he turns to the crowd and he tells the crowd, V'zois, then this is the tachlis. This is why we are here. Why are we here? We're here for the kedusha. We're here for the neshama. We're here to show Hashem what we're all about. And he concludes and he tells them the famous words that when Avram Avinu went to the Kedah, he only went with one child. Avram sacrificed his one child, Yitzchak. But we go, what do we go with? We're going with our entire family, all our children. Can you imagine the impression that's going to make up in Shemayim, all the neshamais, all the karbanos? And with that, they all had a little bit more life of them as they walked into the gas chambers. None of us are walking into the gas chambers. And many of us perhaps even wonder if we'd be able to be strong in such situations. But one thing is we have to realize as we begin saying Kinnos, as we begin trying to get a little deeper in our connection, a little more into our own little world, as we go into our mavucha, as we go into our confusion, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in his inner chambers, we go into our inner chambers and we dig deep and we look for that neshama and we look for that feeling. And what we come out with is that mavucha, we come out with that confusion. And it's pathetic as we hear so many saras. It's pathetic like those children in the cancer ward. Which sarah is better? Which Shevet had it worse? But slowly, hopefully we'll begin to feel the connection as our neshama start crying, as we start realizing the severity of life, the purpose of life, and hopefully as we take the next few hours to read the Kinnos, to connect on a little bit of a deeper level, we'll start to allow that little bit of light, that neshama, to shine, and we'll slowly start to connect. And it will be difficult, and you're going to want to go out, and you'll want to just forget about it, because it's difficult to connect. That place of mevucha, that place when you're in your own little Dalet Amos, is not an easy place to be in. But the longer you stay in that place, the longer you hold on to the severity, the longer you hold on to the seriousness, the more you try to dig deep, is the more kedusha that ultimately will generate. The more we'll mourn, the more we'll realize that we do indeed need the Beis HaMikdash. As our neshama starts coming forth, we'll start to realize this is the place that we need to live our life of our neshama, our life of the Beis HaMikdash, our life with a little bit more of HaKadosh Baruch Hu within it. And B'siyata Dishmaya, the Kinnos, will be more of a healing process, as the tears will slowly, perhaps not come out, but crying from within. Healing, allowing our neshamas to be a little more whole, a little more real, as we connect on the most deep and most meaningful ways to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mourning, hoping, anticipating for the day that Hashem will finally stay with us, come out of those inner chambers and bring the Beis HaMikdash.